are you? And where are you going? What do you want?
Hello and welcome to Business Lessons from the Military. I'm your host, Kevin Bemmel, and I'm here every Tuesday at 10 a.m. Pacific Time to talk about military history, doctrine, and leadership practices from which I distill lessons that you can apply to your businesses and professional practices. So today I'm going to be talking about the Civil War battle, the Battle of Antietam, which took place on September 17th, 1862. So it'll be the 163rd anniversary of the Battle of Antietam tomorrow. And this Civil War is perhaps not surprisingly one of the most studied wars in which historians and scholars engage here in America. It was the most bloody war because people on both sides of the conflict were Americans, and it changed the direction of the country quite significantly. So, and it was a step in the realization of the values that the founders of the country had espoused in the Declaration of Independence and also in the U.S. Constitution. So it's a particularly good place to go for lessons of any sort. But I think at least a couple of the lessons that I talk about in the second part of the show will be, different than those that I've talked about on other shows. So let's get a little context of what was going on before the Battle of Antietam. So by 1862, the Civil War had been going on for over a year. The Union, which was the North, and the Confederacy, which was the South, they were locked in what can only be termed as a brutal conflict over secession, which the Confederate States thought they had a right to do, that the Union was not inviolate, and the Constitution did not make it so. Over slavery, of course, the central issue, and in many ways, the issue that triggered the South's secession from the Union when Abraham Lincoln was elected as a Republican on the anti-slavery platform. And then finally, the idea of states' rights. So this is something that has gotten renewed attention, I should say, recently. The federal system, we talk about the checks and balances within the Constitution between the three branches of government, the executive, the legislative, and the judicial. But there's another set of checks and balances that is supposed to go on because we live in a federal system, meaning that there's a check and balance between the people, the states, and the federal government. And in fact, the U.S. Constitution delegates specific powers to the federal government and specifically reserves all other powers to the states or the people. And so this idea of states' rights, what the states have the authority to do and what the federal government has the authority to do, was much in question at the time, and was much in question in the early days of the Republic, and it was another of the issues over which the Civil War was fought. So the Confederacy had won several victories, especially in the Eastern Theater in 1861 and earlier in 1862. The Confederate forces were led by General Robert E. Lee, He was a former commandant of the U.S. Military Academy who had returned to the South, to his home state of Virginia, and had agreed to lead the Confederate forces. The battles that he won included what is known as the Second Battle of Bull Run, or Second Manassas, in August of 1862. And because of these victories, Lee decided to launch an invasion of the North by moving his Army of Northern Virginia into Maryland. And he had at least three aims in doing this. One was to attempt to influence Northern elections and possibly sway Northerners toward suing for peace. That was number one. And number two was to gain supplies from the fertile northern countryside. The fact of the matter is, while the fighting was brutal, the North had to use absolutely scorched earth tactics on a military level to defeat the South. The typical Southern soldier was just a more competent soldier. The esprit de corps of the South was superior to the North. And probably most importantly, the generalship of the South overall was superior to the generalship of the North, especially in the first, couple, 3 years of the Civil War. What the South could not match was the industrial output of the North and the naval, the strength of the naval forces that the North used to blockade the South. That's not to say that the blockade was 100% effective. It certainly was not. But the North's ability, well, first of all, the miles of railroad, the number of factories with which the North started the Civil War far outstripped that of the South. And the ability of the North to manufacture the necessities of warfare was far, far greater than the South. The ability of the North to grow food was greater than in the South. The South grew primarily crops such as cotton, indigo, tobacco, and rice. Those were the four most prominent cash crops in the South. So food was not the kind of cash crop in the South that it was in the North, where wheat and rye and other grains were grown, typically in such abundance that there was a big distilling industry in the North, because the bumper crops of grain would spoil if they weren't used. And so turning them into whiskey was a good way of essentially preserving those agricultural supplies. So Lee thought that he could essentially commandeer some of the supplies that the North was producing. And then finally, Lee wanted to encourage Maryland, a border state, to join the Confederacy. Now, the District of Washington, D.C., Washington District of Columbia, where the national government sits, is essentially surrounded by Maryland. And Abraham Lincoln took extraordinary steps to keep Maryland in the North. And it would have been a significant morale booster had General Lee been able to convince Maryland to join the Confederacy. So that was the South's sort of overall plan, or motivation anyway, for its invasion of the North that led to the Battle of Antietam. On the Union side, the Union Army was commanded by George B. McClellan. McClellan was no fan of Abraham Lincoln. He ended up running against, essentially attempting to run against him for president after his experience as a commanding general. And he led the Union Army of the Potomac, to be specific, the Union Army that was in Maryland and had, among other responsibilities, that of defending Washington, D.C. Now, he had Lee's battle plan for Antietam. It was famously known as the Lost Order or Special Order 191. But in any event, despite having Lee's battle plans, McClellan was very cautious. He delayed aggressively going after Lee, and this gave Lee and the Confederates time to consolidate their position and in the end avoid disaster. So the biggest problem was with McClellan was he would train and plan and get ready, but he would never take any action. That was essentially his reputation. So that sets the initial scene. The battle itself, okay, as I mentioned, it took place on September 17th, 1862, near Sharpsburg, Maryland, along Antietam Creek, which is, of course, where it got its name. The Union Army of the Potomac had approximately 87,000 soldiers in it, of which 12,400, there were 12,400 casualties. 21, these are approximate numbers, of course, approximately 12,400 casualties, approximately 2,100 killed. The Confederate Army of Northern Virginia was comprised of approximately 38,000 soldiers, less than half of McClellan's army. Nonetheless, it suffered approximately 10,300 casualties, or over a quarter of its numbers, and approximately 1,500 deaths. So, much higher casualty rate among the Confederates. And as I talk about the battle, I think you'll see why. So the morning of September 17th found, 1862, of course, found the action taking place in a cornfield. So the Union forces attacked the Confederate left flank in a series of bloody assaults. Now, if you've ever seen a movie about combat in the 19th century, it's not at all like combat in the 20th century, like you see in World War II movies or even World War I movies. So, you generally speaking still had troops facing each other, firing, although from more strategic positions rather than just sort of marching toward each other while firing. However, the tactic of sort of firing from behind trees and such, which had started during the American War for Independence, was used in the Civil War, became more frequently used, especially by the South, who was very adept at this kind of warfare. So, these Union charges, basically against the Confederate left flank, caused a great deal of casualties. But despite the repeated Union charges, the Confederates held their position, so they did not give way. And the terrain and the dense corn, if you can picture these, dense stalks of fields of corn with the corn stalks, which can for sure grow taller than a man. Fighting in that situation, the visibility was poor, the coordination was severely limited, and it made the fighting very chaotic, and hence why the casualties, at least one of the reasons why the casualties were so high. So the initial Union action ended up not displacing the Confederates at all. And so, the Union essentially withdrew from that attack, but the battle continued. So midday took place in a sunken road that came to be known as Bloody Lane. So the Union troops in this case attacked the Confederate center along a natural sunken road. And the Confederates initially held strong, But eventually, the Union forces were able to push through, inflicting massive casualties. So, if we're talking about the Union had more than twice the number of soldiers that the Confederates had, and so by midday, the just the superior size of the Union Army was starting to take its toll. Okay, and it was not in any way, shape, or form superior generalship in this case. So the scene became it became iconic. Sounds positive. It became horrific, a horrific uh, um, picture of the Civil War because of the huge number of casualties. The battle continued into the afternoon, where Union General Ambrose Burnside, him famous for what are now known as sideburns, um, so he attempted to cross a stone bridge to attack the Confederate right. However, Confederate sharpshooters repelled this assault for hours, despite again being heavily outnumbered. And when the Union forces were when Ambrose and the Union forces were finally able to cross the bridge, it was too late to decisively defeat Lee's army. By then, it was heading into evenings, and reinforcements arrived that allowed Lee to stabilize his position. And McClellan, despite having more than a 2-to-1 advantage in troops, he didn't fully press the attack, allowing Lee to withdraw back into Virginia the following day. And it temporarily ended the Northern invasion, but it did keep his it ended, I should say, it ended the Northern invasion, and it kept his army intact. So while it was perhaps a tactical defeat for the Confederates, it was by no means a strategic defeat of the Confederacy. And so the war continued to rage on for another roughly 2 years. So, what were the consequences then of the Battle of Antietam? Well, first of all, um, ostensibly the Union had won. They had repulsed the Confederate invasion of the North. And so President Lincoln was able to claim a Union victory, first of all, which was something he was longing to do. And because he was able to claim that victory, he was then able to issue what became known as the Emancipation Proclamation. And the Emancipation Proclamation freed slaves in the states currently in rebellion against the United States. This is one of the criticisms of President Lincoln and the Emancipation Proclamation was it did not free slaves in what were called the border states, Tennessee, Kentucky, Maryland, and those in favor of the abolition of slavery excoriated Abraham Lincoln for not making an outright declaration of the freeing of all slaves. From Lincoln's perspective, he was trying to end slavery, but he was also working to keep the Union together. And so he compromised with the Emancipation Proclamation, allowing slavery to continue in border states to encourage them to stay within the Union and not abandon the Union and join the Confederacy. So it was perhaps it was no doubt it was a compromise. It was perhaps a justified compromise. If the border states had gone over to the Confederacy, and if the Confederacy had either fought the North to a stalemate or won the Civil War, well, for sure, slavery was not going to end. And so Lincoln looked at it from the standpoint of, I have to win this war if I want to abolish slavery, and I'm gonna make a compromise here that hopefully will weaken the South's ability to prosecute the war, and then we'll deal with the abolition of slavery completely once the war was done. And of course, post Civil War, 14th and 15th Amendments to the Constitution, the 13th and 14th Amendments to the Constitution were passed that abolished slavery. Okay, so the other thing that Lincoln wanted to do was prevent foreign countries from recognizing the Confederacy, essentially European powers, Spain, France, England. Now, England was reliant on raw cotton coming from the South for it to use in its mills. The Confederacy was counting on England to support it in order to get the cotton and to run the Northern blockade. But in the event, rather than do that, England turned to other sources for cotton, including India, which was a colony of England by that time. So, the victory of the North at Antietam helped Lincoln toward his goal of preventing European powers from recognizing the Confederacy. The military consequences were not particularly favorable to the North. Lee retreated back to Virginia. He kept his army intact. McClellan was criticized for not aggressively pursuing and defeating Lee's army, and he was eventually removed from command. McClellan remained bitter against President Lincoln for removing him from command. But the reality was McClellan was not a good commanding general. He didn't have the aggressiveness that was necessary to confront the Confederacy. And the fact of the matter is he probably should have been removed earlier. That was a personnel mistake that President Lincoln made. So the long-term impact of Antietam was it started to shift the war's momentum. Until Antietam, really the South had the momentum in terms of military action. So the repulsing of Lee's invasion of the North at Antietam gave the Union a morale boost. And even though the Confederacy remained a formidable military threat, Antietam marked a shift in how the North pursued the war, especially militarily. As I mentioned a moment ago, it did lead to McClellan being replaced, and eventually, of course, Ulysses S. Grant became the commanding general, and along with along with other Northern generals, particularly Sherman. I think I've talked about Sherman in the Battle of Atlanta in a previous show, they pursued what amounted to just a scorched earth military plan against the South that eventually led to the South conceding, and at Appomattox, Lee surrendered. So that's the history of the battle itself. Let's take a quick break and then we'll look at some lessons. America is a maritime nation. Our freedom and security depend on strong sea services. The Beverly Hills Council of the Navy League stands with our Navy, Marine Corps, Coast Guard, and Merchant Marine through community support, education, and advocacy. For over 120 years, Americans of all walks of life have heeded our call. No prior military service is required to join our mission. The Beverly Hills Council of the Navy League of the United States. Help us support those who serve at sea. Visit NavyLeague.org. So, this is Business Lessons from the Military, and I'm your host, Kevin Bemmel. On the 163rd anniversary of the Civil War Battle of Antietam, we're talking about. I just talked about the history of the battle, and I'm going to talk about some lessons that can be learned from it. So, one of the ongoing discussions that one of my closest business associates, Bill Gross, who I've talked about a number of times on this and my other shows, one of the things we talk about quite regularly is the difference between what Bill calls real estate time and lawyer's time. So, real estate time basically means you don't put off until the next minute what you could have done a minute ago. I think that's a good way to summarize it. In other words, alacrity in getting things done is part of the real estate ethos. And in general, I think that's true. Whereas for lawyers, speed in getting things done, oftentimes, I mean, unless it's something that's absolutely crucial, a case literally hangs in the balance, you don't see that the same kind of alacrity in pursuing matters. Now, there are reasons why that's the case. When you're drafting legal documents, they need to be drafted, they need to be reread, they need to sit and read again later to in order to detect mistakes, in order to reconsider the strategy contained within the document. So, reflection is a part of the legal process. But for those of us who are used to working on real estate time, it can be frustrating, right? That it takes so long, right? And so this is, I think, the first lesson and perhaps the most important lesson we can learn from the Battle of Antietam, and that is opportunity can be fleeting. So McClellan had Lee's battle plans. He had numerical superiority, again, more than 2 to 1. He finally put Lee on the run, and yet he did not pursue Lee and deliver the coup de grace, as we say. And this led directly to an elongation of the Civil War. McClellan should have been aggressive in going after Lee and using the intelligence that he had, the battle plans, and he should not have let Lee move back into Virginia unhampered. He should have been chasing him and harassing him and attempting to cut off his retreat, and destroyed his army, or at least gained the surrender of his army and maybe even the capture of Lee himself. If McClellan had done that in 1862, a lot of the carnage of the military aspect of the Civil War could have been avoided, not to mention the destruction of farms, plantations, just the ability of the South to operate economically. That could have been avoided as well. And so this is part of the inherent dilemma in business, right? When should we move quickly to take advantage of opportunity, to press our advantage, to act on a new idea, a new product, a new service? When should we sit back? And I think in general, we should be moving quickly. That's the bias these days. Move fast, take the chance you're going to break some things, make adjustments as you move. That really should be the attitude in a business today. And the fact of the matter is, the race goes to the swift, right? That's an old saying that's been around for I don't know how many generations, but it is generally true. Right? Now, we count on our lawyers, our accountants, our advisors to advise us when a little more time should be taken in order to be prudent, and that's fine. If our advisors are giving us reasons why we should reconsider a rapid strategy, they make sense to us, then maybe we should slow things down a little bit. But in general, the bias should be toward alacrity. And not doing so well, almost surely will mean we lose out on opportunity. Opportunity is fleeting. It just is. And we need to be poised to grasp that opportunity when it comes our way. So that's number one. Number two, a risk assessment and aggressiveness must be balanced. And this is another one of McClellan's faults, is he could not make a proper assessment of risk versus assertiveness. He was just absolutely risk averse. And that's why, for example, he didn't follow Lee into Virginia. What if he was being led into a trap? What if there was a whole nother, army waiting there to reinforce Lee? There's always what ifs. But the fact of the matter is that he had Lee's battle plan. He knew that this wasn't some feint in order to draw him into into a trap of some kind. And so his concern that it might be a trap or something. Look, you rarely in business do we actually know what our competitors are going to attempt to do. We don't have that level of clarity. For McClellan to have that level of clarity and to still not be able to make a proper risk versus aggressiveness assessment shows that he was just unable to do so. And we have to have that skill. That is probably the top 1, 2, or 3 skills one needs in order to make a business successful. And the fact of the matter is, we don't have to always make that assessment correctly. It's just we need to do it correctly a majority of the time, 51% of the time. Now, I say that a little bit tongue in cheek, but we don't need to be concerned about making the right call every time. The fact of the matter is, often we can recover from a mistake we made in assessing the risk versus aggressiveness balance. And that's, Lee made the same assessment, and in the end his assessment proved wrong. He was not able to gain his objective, and yet he was able to live to fight another day. He and his army were, while they suffered, again, over 40%, over 25% casualties, they were able to still continue the fight for another 2 years. So the same is true for us in businesses. And there are notable mistakes made that where the risk of taking an action, it turns out was too high, but businesses took them anyway, and they still live to do business another day. The Oracle has been in the news quite a bit of late because of the huge run up in its stock value, because it's made several. It's signed several huge deals of late, right? So, I was talking to someone yesterday. It's like, where did Oracle come from? Oracle has been around for 2 or 3 decades now. So the fact that it was not in the limelight doesn't mean that it wasn't being aggressive in pursuing its business. It was, okay? It's just it took these huge deals for Wall Street to take a closer look and realize that, all in all, Oracle and Larry Ellison in particular is very good at assessing risk versus how aggressive it needs to be, right? And so Oracle finally got its due for being able to make that assessment. So that's number two. Number three, uh, intelligence alone doesn't guarantee success. So I mentioned a couple minutes ago, McClellan had access to Special Order 191. He knew what Lee was going to do, and he still didn't act aggressively. It's like you don't get better intelligence than having your enemies, your competitors' battle plans, right? So this is why when a company is waiting and waiting, trying to get more information and more information, that is a dead end. Even the fact of the matter is, if a company is waiting to have perfect or even very high quality intelligence before making a decision and acting, that's a company that's probably unlikely to act even if it had such intelligence, because it wouldn't recognize the value of that intelligence, right? So we can gather ever more information, but in the end we have to be prepared to act despite not having as much information as we want. Okay. And there's just no getting around that. That is the nature of the uncertainty of business. And that's why there's been a lot of talk over the last few months, as the Trump administration has issued the tariffs. It caused a lot of uncertainty. And the uncertainty has been played up a lot in the business media. And there are a number of businesses that have taken a more cautious approach. On the other hand, there were a number of businesses that they looked at the potential tariff threat and they said, well, if this happens, we don't want to have to pay higher tariffs. So we're going to bring in our goods now in larger amounts that we would have, and we'll stockpile them in order to make sure that we have the supplies we need to run our businesses, and no matter what happens with the tariffs. So this is a situation where there was no amount of intelligence that could be gathered that would tell a business more clearly what to do, because it was going to be, no matter what, it was going to be several months at least before what was happening with tariffs became clear. And so businesses couldn't wait around to get perfect or even high quality intelligence. They had to make a decision based on what they knew. Okay, and that connects with the first one. We should be defaulting to action. So that's number three. Number four, momentum matters. If you launch a new initiative, you launch a new product or a new service, if you see that it's gaining some momentum, the most important thing you can do is very quickly figure out how are you going to take advantage of that momentum, right? So Lee's victories before Antietam gave him the confidence to invade the North. Now, in the event, the invasion wasn't successful, but that doesn't mean that Lee made the wrong decision. In fact, he made the right decision. He did his best to take advantage of the momentum that the South had gained in the first year or so of the Civil War. The fact that this particular battle went against him by no means put the South out of the war. McClellan could potentially have done that, but he didn't, right? And so while it did cause a momentum shift toward the North, that it was not inevitable that the North was going to keep the momentum. Okay, and Lee made attempts to regain the momentum, and it's why, in part, the war dragged on for another 2+ years, right? So, if you have again an initiative that you're launching in your company, Okay. If you have not already figured out what the follow on plan is, well, you know, get going with it, right? The worst thing that'll happen is you'll have developed a plan for taking advantage of momentum. The momentum does not materialize, and so you don't launch phase two. Okay. But it's not wasted because the gains you can make by being ready with the next step, okay, will mean that if you are able to gain the momentum, it will be even that much more positive for your company, for your organization. Okay, so that's number 4. Momentum matters. Next, leadership under pressure shapes outcomes. So the difference between McClellan and Lee couldn't be sharper than in the Battle of Antietam. Lee was aggressive, seeking to take advantage of the momentum he had created in the first year or so of the war. He attempted to take the battle to the north, right? Force them to fight on their territory. Okay. McClellan, for his part, he wanted to do more planning, more training, more preparation. And this, in the end, really demoralized, it did as much to demoralize his men as anything else. Now, it's not to say that one should be precipitous in engaging in battle, certainly not warfare battle, but even, the kind of battle we have in business without being prepared. Of course, we want to prepare, but seeking perfect preparation is a fool's game. We're never going to be perfectly prepared. We're never going to have enough people. We're never going to be able to know well enough what our unknowns are to that as a way to mitigate the downside, potential downside of a program not happening the way we want it to. So leadership then becomes the decisive factor. And Lee consistently had the trust of his men. They respected him. They were confident he was going to lead him to victory. On the Union side, it was pretty much exactly the opposite. The rank and file Union soldiers did not respect McClellan. They were not at all confident he was going to lead them to victory. In fact, their attitude was much like Lincoln's at the time, and became even worse after Antietam, that McClellan didn't know what he was doing. He was not going to lead them to victory, and in fact, he was going to lead them to disaster. Now, when you think about it, going back to the casualties, so while the percentage of Union soldiers, Union soldier casualties was only roughly 15%, as against over 25% for the Confederacy, nonetheless, the Union Army suffered approximately 12,400 casualties, or about 20% more than the Confederacy. And at least some of that addition can be attributed to McClellan's poor generalship. So, for all the time that he took to train and supply his men, yet the casualties they suffered were higher than the Confederacy. So, leadership under pressure matters. McClellan should have pursued Lee into Virginia. He should have at least have attempted to bring a close to the war in September of 1862, rather than let the war go on for another 2+ years. He did not. The pressure on him basically caused him to be afraid to move forward, demonstrating that he didn't have the qualities of leadership under pressure that were necessary for the Union and for the North. Okay. Finally, strategic victories can outweigh tactical outcomes. So the Union claimed a strategic victory, although it was not a strategic victory; it was a tactical victory. But they claimed a strategic victory and Lincoln used that as the grounds to issue the Emancipation Proclamation, despite what was a pretty indecisive a pretty indecisive outcome, right? And so, although in reality it wasn't much of a victory on the part of the Union, um, through messaging, the Union was able to make itself look like it had gained a true strategic victory, right? And so, in the end, uh, you know, Abraham Lincoln was able to, in essence, paper over the fact that McClellan was a poor general, was not aggressive enough, and sort of raise the war to higher stakes with the Emancipation Proclamation and with a subsequent electoral victory that solidified his reelection and staying at the head of the United States during this time of war. So we need to, as in business, we need to distinguish between tactical victories and losses and strategic victories and losses. Okay, they are not the same thing. So we can lose out on getting a particular piece of business. That says nothing all by itself as to whether we have a sound strategy for expanding our businesses, expanding our practices. Now, if we repeatedly lose out on business, then we need to take a look at our tactics and our strategy, our growth strategy, and probably rework them. But merely because we lose one tactical battle, or for that matter, win a tactical battle, that does not mean that we have the proper strategy. Okay. Now, it may be tempting to try and paper over a strategic loss and try and convince other people that it is a victory. And if the stakes are as high for our company as they were for the Union and the Confederacy during the Civil War, that might work. But in general, I think people are they're very jaded these days. They're much more skeptical. And so trying to create victory at a rhetorical level as opposed to actually achieve victory is not necessarily going to work in this day and age. And so I recommend caution and better to look as frankly as you can at the outcome of a particular initiative and assess it frankly. Did this work? Did this not work? Is this our first setback? If it is, we probably need to try again. But if this is our fourth or fifth setback, it's probably time for a change in strategy and a change in tactics. Right. So those are the lessons I think can be learned from the Battle of Antietam. Again, celebrating its 163rd birthday or anniversary, not birthday, anniversary tomorrow. So I thank you very much for joining me, especially my live viewers. Always good to see you. And if you have any comments, questions, criticisms, all the links to social media will be in the show notes when this episode posts on YouTube. So for tomorrow, Wednesday at 10 a.m., it's my show, People Making Money. And then next week on Monday at 10 a.m., will be Trusts and Estates Weekly, and then on for the rest of the week. So I, again, thank you very much for joining me, wishing you a wonderful rest of the day, and signing off as I always do. Marie, darling, you are my belle. You are indeed my Southern belle. Courage